Thank you very much, Ricky. So thank you all for coming. I know you've been torn between watching Shashi Tharoor on the other side and Kashmir cuisine, and I've come instead to listen as to whether the creative economy can make a difference. We've got wonderful people here. We've got Skinder, who's the head of Director of Arts of the British Council worldwide. We've got the wonderful Piali Ray from Sampad. Piali has been the sort of anchor for much of the arts in Birmingham for most of her life, and certainly most of my life. And they do a wonderful job out there. We've got Roly Keating, the Chief Executive of the British Library, who's had 2 years of trying to reinvent the space and reinvent the way the creative sector looks at. And we've got the Principal Secretary of Tourism from the government of Rajasthan, which is the host city to where the Jaipur Literature Festival is based, way back in Jaipur. So absolutely delighted to have all of you. Skinder, I'm going to start, or rather, Piali, let me start with you. You know, Ricky sort of said creative sector, sunshine industry, so on and so forth. For 2 years, the sunshine industry that we all know has been trying to leapfrog into the center of the world's attention. What stops us from doing so?
Aren't we there? I thought we are.
We think we're there, but sadly the rest of the world is yet to catch up on that idea.
Yes. I mean, we've all been through a hugely challenging period. I mean, the pandemic came as a shock. We were on a steep learning curve. And I have to say that the arts sector took it by the horns. And it totally, opened up a new vista. I mean, there were huge challenges in terms of finances, of work drying up, the performances dried up. The freelancers in particular were hugely challenged because while, people who were in employment got some, support from the government, furlough money was released. But the freelancers who were out there on their own didn't have that support. However, there was a real burst of talent online. I think people learned by themselves, and they were connecting across the world, across cities, across regions, and introducing themselves and connecting with each other. How that impact on economy, I don't know, but it definitely opened up a whole new area of work, new openings for artists, new creativity. I think artists are very good when they're faced with challenge to circumvent it, and we find ways of, finding new routes of creativity. Yeah, challenges them to bring out the best in some of us. So I've seen artists who've, in a way, blossomed in that period with new work. Leaving aside the finances, artistically, I think we've reached out and we've expanded our fields. The financial hardships is still continuing, and in spite of what Rishi says, it's not been addressed.
I'll come back to the financial hardships in a bit. Roly, Piali says that creative people really they take a challenge, they look at it in the horns, or they take it by the horns, and they find new ways. However, the general impression is that creative people, long hair, wishy-washy, can't be trusted, have not a sensible idea in their head, and yet in the last 2 years, you've completely had to transform the way you've done business here.
Yeah, no, I mean, everyone in the arts or the culture sector has, Sanjoy, and I think Piali's right. It was an amazing and amazingly quick regeneration, a sort of mental switch that happened very, very swiftly. And I mean, a few reflections on creativity in the pandemic. One is, yes, the internet was seized where it could be. We'll come back to the challenges in the financial. Sure. But equally, it was very, very clear that something profound had been taken away from people. And one thing we mustn't forget is what the pandemic did was a brutal, but perhaps in historic terms, wonderful reminder to the planet of what actually the full flourishing of creativity should be and can be in lives. And your festival similarly brilliantly reinvented itself online. You grew your global reach, but none of us would say that it's not even better to be back together as human beings together. So I think that reaffirmation and almost rediscovering what the arts can do for people's soul, I think, is one lesson we've got from it. But to address that question about improvisation, resilience, creativity, yes, and I would build on what both you and Piali have said. I think it proved in real time that people with creative imaginations are in many ways best placed to respond to the huge civilizational challenges of climate change, climate breakdown, and economic social change around us, precisely because in their creative work they're always making unexpected connections. They're trying to find non-linear solutions or look at surprising angles, and that's proven itself. And maybe we'll come back to this, but actually I think when we begin to think about the wider economy, I think so-called traditional businesses and industries could perhaps learn quite a lot from the way creative people run their businesses and run their work, because actually we're all going to have to live and think that way.
Skinder, exactly what Roly said, that, we're able to find solutions. We're able to do things differently. You've been working the arts, not just here, but across the world. You're Director of Arts, British Council. The recent reports that the British Council has done in India, or the Durga Puja report that showed that it's the second largest event that contributes to all of Bengal's economy, the second largest. You've done a report on publishing, for example, that's recently come out, as well as a report that we all jointly did on the impact of COVID. Why do we have to continuously convince people that there is value in the arts? And do you feel that it's important to also ensure that there is empirical evidence of hard numbers in terms of the impact? What about all the other stuff that we do that you can't actually put a value to? Taking from MasterCard's ad line, a priceless occasion, a priceless, unforgettable memory, which gets embedded. Isn't that important in all of what everybody's been saying?
Very much so. And firstly, thank you, Sanjoy, for inviting me here. We have much love for your festival, and you've certainly brought the summer and the heat into maybe too much heat from yesterday. But yes, the situation with all the empirical evidence and the kind of the science within the arts is something that is actually necessary, to demonstrate and prove. But it feels that we're always having to do this. That's where the problem lies. So earlier I was listening to the translator for Gitanjali Shri, and he talked about you don't remember like a politician's speech, but you remember memorable art that stays with you. So in British Council, for example, art is one of the three central pillars, and the reason for that is it connects people, it connects cultures, it creates a sense of questioning, it looks at the kind of forward aspect. There is something that's very tangible about it in terms of its impact. So the £3.8 billion worth of economy in the Durga Puja festival in that moment is a massive contribution to West Bengal. These are important facts that politicians also need to hear. Politicians are driven by data, and we're having to influence masses, big populations. A lot of the mass populations may not experience or understand the nuances of form or aesthetic, but when they experience that narrative, they certainly feel the emotion and the feeling of what knowledge and wisdom is in that space. But it can be something that is seen as worthy but woolly. So to shift away from the kind of long-haired hippie to the kind of lean machine that art needs to also be, it is about telling the story in a way that is business-like, but also compelling, that doesn't lose its essence. So the essence is very important too.
But Skinder, we've seen that, at least here in the UK, the British government having cut or having loaned money to the British Council, as opposed to giving money because they know that British Council is sort of an arm of theirs to do smart power. Similarly with the BBC, which has taken away of British life, of British democracy, of British principles, yet they're planning to axe both these to some extent. So have we failed as the creative sector to sort of impress upon politicians the value and worth of these two institutions that are global?
Well, clearly the model of, I mean, a lot of people probably don't realise the model that British Council operates within. So it has a commercial side to it. And I think most commercial businesses in creativity generally have suffered during this pandemic. Some have folded, some have taken loans, some have had furlough programs to help support. And we've had a bit of that, of course. But our operation is global. So when you've got a £1.3 billion operation where 70-80% comes from commercial income and it's been hit, the government are assuming that we'll make it back as a business. And we're confident we will. And actually, we're coming back and we're at, I suppose, 70-80% of where we were in the years before. And we will get there. But I think the issue around sort of government cutting or going down that route where, institutions are felt to be on the back foot defending means that there is an issue in terms of how we're defining ourselves and how we're perceived. And some of that perception is possibly because we need to be more scientific about how we're presenting our story and narrative in terms of its impact. It's clear that the impact is having huge impact, actually.
I'm going to come back to the impact, but Gayatri, Rajasthan pretty much boxes above its weight. Across the world, people look at it as a place of palaces, of great romance, its lakes, its forts, and everything that goes with it, the intrigue, the romance, the great wedding destination that it is. And Rajasthan's economy, to a large extent, is driven by tourism, especially at the very local level. Does your government, or do governments in your experience, understand that? And do you receive enough support as a department to be able to take that forward?
Well, Sanjoy, as you know, Rajasthan being a traditional tourism-oriented district, where almost tourism contributes 11% of state GSDP. So tourism and allied activities. So in allied activities, we include the local artists, the local handicrafts, the local performers, musicians, the puppeteers, all kinds of artists, handicrafts person who are contributing and making the state even more attractive. The value addition that is being done by the creative side has added kind of what you said, romanticism, kind of heritage, the feeling of culture, the feeling of timelessness. When you go to forts and palaces, you actually get transformed. It is not because of that building, it is because the people, their culture, how they have kept that alive. And fortunately, prior to pandemic and post-pandemic, government has been very sensitive to the aspirations, hopes and expectations of all the artists, all the cultural sector people involved. And post-pandemic, to give them a support, like Piali was mentioning, that it did receive a big setback, because when all the things were closed, when there were no tourists, no performances, that was a tough time. But as the restrictions were eased and as we started getting tourists, domestic to begin with and now international tourists, government has come up in a very big way, giving them a complete social package. It is that social security insurance cover for the handicraftsmen, for the artisans, for the writers, for their children, for their entire family, so that they do not have to bother about their day-to-day mundane requisites, about their survival instincts, and they are able to focus on their arts, whether it is performing arts or whatever it is. Secondly, we are also trying to give them platforms like GLF, not London but Jaipur, and other kinds of activities where we are trying to bring all our creative people on one platform and exposing them. You might have seen just the recent example of Mame Khan walking the red carpet in Cannes. So it is this diverse kind of history and culture and economy that we have, that the state government is trying to promote and preserve and give it a support, because we know directly and indirectly it is the backbone of our economy.
Roly, every year you have to make, or every 3 years, you have to make the case for funding for the British Library, and at some level show that there's a value. Now we know that your archives are, you can't put a value to the archives, you can't put value to recorded history, and yet you have to make this argument year on year. I'll get so many people through the door, X number of people will write books maybe, somebody will mention the British Library in their speech. How do you manage to balance your budget, and how difficult has it grown over the past few years?
I think it ebbs and flows, probably in any country, these debates, and it's never, as Skinder was saying, it's never and shouldn't be a perfect science, actually. We talk about, sometimes it's all jargon when you're talking to policymakers. Of course you have to do this, but you talk about building public value rather than straightforward economic, which is quite a generous thought. It's not, it has to have some numbers there, because all of us, it's not just politicians, all of us are attuned to some degree to quantification of numbers. So it's not responsible just to blithely go through and just improvise and hope for the best. But numbers are never, ever enough. And I think we can all in the sector be pretty adamant about that. It's both and. So, I mean, listening to some of the conversation, it's some things you can measure, some things you can't. Some things have a value, some things are beyond value. And so it's both and, it's numbers and stories, it's quantification and feelings, and it's demonstrating narratives about how lives are changed, sometimes, dare I say it, even helping the decision makers, the policy makers, the politicians themselves have experiences, so they can see and feel for themselves the intangible thing that culture does. And so, yes, at the British Library, we're a very broad-based institution. We do all sorts of different things. And there are corners of what we do that are very susceptible to numbers. We even support businesses, and we, like museums and galleries, we get footfall and people through, so we contribute a little bit to the tourism economy and so on. But the truth is, the big, deep, literally deep mission here, we're all sitting, by the way, on top of 5 stories of collections below. This is the roof of our vault here, so you can feel the knowledge rising up.
Seeping through.
Seeping up beneath it. And
let's get a politician here.
But it's, there you go. But that feeling that you get of knowing that is something that is not, not every one of those books is going to get read or sampled by someone now. But we do sometimes, for instance, try and convey about what that means to future generations, and that actually if you maintain culture in the here and now, you're actually putting down roots for 100 years out, 200 years out. We couldn't do what we do now if brilliant people hadn't persuaded decision makers 200 years ago to protect an institution then. So it's that kind of handing on of a baton thing. And I think that's maybe particularly true for us, but I think it's true of skills in the performing arts and traditions and elsewhere as well.
Piali, Birmingham was City of Culture, now it's going to be a city for Commonwealth Games. You're expected to sing and dance and earn your keep. And then once it finishes, everybody will move on. What happens? Why is it so cyclical?
Coventry was City of Culture. Birmingham lost. We keep trying. But we got the games. So we're very, very, very proud and very, very happy about that. What happens afterwards? I mean, there, of course, officially on paper, there's a huge legacy plan. I mean, that was expected.
There's always a legacy plan.
There's always a legacy plan. But people like us who live in the city, who will be there, who were there before, and who will be there after the games, are very, very aware that this will create expectations and they avoid. And if we know that, so you mitigate certain risks. So we start preparing for it. And we are very aware of that. I know organizations like us who are in the city, we are talking about those, and the city council is talking about it. But how do we visualize the city in next year, 3 year, 5 years time? Politicians talking. But at least we are in that dialogue. So I think I hope they're listening. There is in Birmingham, it's very, very diverse. It's very political as well. So there is a groundswell of strong opinions. Black Lives Matter is a huge issue that we are all part of, and that that in its those dialogues are very important in how it will shape. It's not just carrying on what we do before, we'll carry on that tradition. No, it's important that we evolve, we learn. The pandemic has been a huge learning curve, and we have to understand what will work now. So, in Sampad, within my organization, our business is with people. The data and the figures, we feed into that, but we are on the ground at grassroots level, and we are connecting with artists, we are connecting with our audiences, we're connecting with older people, we're connecting with women's groups, the disenfranchised groups, younger people. So that is our economy. That's what has to grow. That's where our investment has to go in, and it is with people like us that we have to keep pushing that argument, that invest here, because that's out there. They are going to bring in those numbers. They are going to generate the economy. So, yeah.
And like you said, it's really again about identity. It's about migration.
Totally.
It's about sexuality. It's about
all of those.
The differences, but also the similarities. And this is what plays out through culture in a city like Birmingham, or for example, Manchester, where Skinder's from, or Bradford, which has seen this whole churn. Has there been a pushback? I mean, even as people like you do so much to be able to bridge that gap, has there been a pushback?
Yeah. I mean, the intercultural dialogue has been a cornerstone of what we do, and we all do that. I mean, Skinder and I have been working together for many, many years. So, of course, that's very important, that there is a deeper understanding and valuation and respect. It doesn't happen overnight, and there are so many other issues which impact on how that dialogue is developed and who's listening and who doesn't want to listen. So, of course, there's a backlash, always, constantly, yeah. But that doesn't mean that we stop talking. So it's persevering, it's continuing. And that's where the energy has to be. And that's where the creative energy is as well, because all of these narratives,
the conflict.
all of these narratives influence how a musician performs and how you connect to your audience, how a dancer is creating work, what are the stories they're talking about. If you don't connect, then you become irrelevant. So at the moment, I mean, a lot of our emphasis in our work is investing in connecting our, expanding their portfolios, because we need to connect with the health sector. Mental health is a huge issue in society. We can't just create art without connecting to some of those very, very important stories and those people and those issues. So, yeah, but artists don't automatically, because you're a good dancer or you're a good singer or a writer, automatically know how to then go and navigate that within that context. So investment has to come.
She talked about navigating the context. Skinder, you were on this side, our side, and then you crossed over and became a suit. You crossed over to the dark side.
Suit with a scarf.
And a suit with a scarf. The experience that you've had as somebody in the world of the creative arts, when you've taken it to British Council and become, like I said, the dark side, has that helped, knowing that, there are these challenges, there are these, as she said, what about all of these other people who don't find the support, who have something to say? They have every power to want to say it, but they're not able to.
It's very important that somebody like myself, who's come from in a sense, the periphery of community, which is actually one of the fastest space of invention, has landed in an institution. Now, I didn't seek this role. This role came to me by some strange destiny. But I took it on for that big reason, and that was that I'm not from an institution, and actually I could bring something to that data I could bring soul to the data. I could create a ripple factorial within the impact of the work that we produce and create. So for me, the key thing is that there is a distance, definitely, within the kind of periphery spaces of invention that are unseen still. But we are making progress. Cities like Birmingham, Coventry, Hull, Belfast, Londonderry, who've taken on these cities of culture, have instigated some really, really positive models, which have been radical. The legacy of them is where the challenge lies. But I have to say, I'm coming across new generation thinkers a lot in this decade of reconnection. Because some might say, well, the last decade was a decade of disconnections because we were echo chambered into our comforts by artificial intelligence. But now it's time to challenge the bias of a system, whether it's institutional history or whether it's the kind of software design of the future. What is important, though, is that we have creative, collaborative, conscious communities actively challenging the institution. So me coming into the institution is actually a good thing. And I always remember in the interview, they asked me, have you got a question for us? And I said, I have one question, and that is, will I fit in the institution, knowing that I come from the periphery neighbourhood of intra and intercultural dynamics, of people in poverty who do not have the privilege that big resources can create and do create and invest in. So the answer was that the institution is looking for that right now. So we are in a space of constant flow and flux and reinvention, or even reincarnation.
Reimagine is the catchword that British Ad Council has had for 20 years. I was part of that first Reimagine project, but it continues.
Well, I'm going to introduce reincarnation instead.
Oh my God.
Roly, he talked about reconnection. It's the decade of reconnection and about creativity. And yet we know that, at least in the academic system, the arts and the sciences are still seen to be two completely different areas. And all of us sitting here know that we need one to be able to bring to fruition the other. What do we need to do to be able to break this divide, these liberal lot from the science lot?
No, and it couldn't be true here, by the way, because this place is about, we're not meant to recognise boundaries here. This is just indivisible knowledge, and we're constantly worrying and thinking about how to do that. I'd so agree. I think this is a very exciting time, by the way, and this is not jargon. I think there is a shift going on. I like the sense of reconnection, and when societies have made breakthroughs creatively, it often has been by luck or circumstances that the periphery has found its way and has turned the institution upside down. And it's cyclical. It doesn't happen all the time, but I think it is happening now. In another part of my life, I'm proud to be a trustee of the Claw Leadership organisation here, which is actually about trying to catch some of the best emerging leaders and sort of superpower them. And the radicalism of the model, in the mental model of a lot of the people going through that course now, is quite different from what it was 20 years ago. The best of them do not see those arts sector boundaries at all. They completely understand that the solutions have to be about joining up, removing boundaries, connecting. And I think there are no simple solutions to doing that, which is why it's such hard work. But I'm afraid you probably do need the culture sector to be the force that opens up those opportunities. And if you do it right, then you will find the right people in the scientific and technological communities, because many of them are sensing this change, but haven't maybe been trained to think that way. And so I think it is a great moment of coming together. And I think if you see some of the best work happening now creatively, actually it is very open to technology and science and different kinds of, we were just talking about some of the work that's on display in Venice at the moment. You really feel that global community of artists. So they're not just there to put art on a wall and go away and sell it. They are there because they believe the world is in a dangerous place and their contribution can help repair it.
Culture sector creating opportunities of connection. Gayatri, in 2020 when COVID happened, because of my long hair, I get to sit on some of these committees. And in one of the task forces,
Are they on the dark side, those committees?
Yeah, on the dark
yes,
side,
yes.
pretty much dark
Only,
side.
it's only because of the hair.
I was rabbiting on about why the arts or artists and artisans needed support. And a minister from the central government said, you know, Sanjay ji, you keep asking about supporting artists. Artists should be giving support to, you know, the PM Cares Fund. Why do they need money? So I thought, maybe he's yanking my chain. Why do they need money? So, you know, I thought he was joking. And then I realized he actually thought that every artist was Shah Rukh Khan or Tom Cruise or Britney Spears or whatever, and didn't make the connection that the ragi in the Gurdwara or a sava maker, the caterer, the food person, the person who was the travel guide, the janitor in the in Kamani Auditorium or wherever, all of these people were committed. And yet I remember your predecessor, Shreya Ghoshal, who was then the principal. I called her and I said, Rajasthan has to do something. And she went to the chief minister and you all created an instant package to, you know, or to support artists and artisans. Is that a growing reality, especially in Rajasthan? Do you feel that it can become that model state, given that it has these large festival formats, it has a lot of dependence on tourism and culture? Can it become a model state, or will it always be valued somewhat differently from everything else?
Well, Sanjoy, from art perspective, what we feel that, as we all know, that art culture is the backbone of our economy, and what you said that Rajasthan took some very innovative and some very forward-looking steps to support its artists. So this package that I was mentioning in my previous talk, I was telling that government recognizes that they need to be supported right from the beginning to the, not I say end of the life, but they need to live in that kind of ecosystem where they have faith that government is there and they can follow their passion. Because it is only out of passion that, as Roly was saying, that it is a mix of ideas. So how you put your ideas and how this ideas has translated over the time and has evolved. Our artists, which we saw a decade back, 2 decades back, 3 decades back, they have evolved trying to match according to the changing expectations. But at the same time, there are expectations from the government as well. Because by and large, all the folk artists, all the folk performers, the traditional handicraftsmen who are very thorough with their work, but because their work was something which required lot of patronizing. Earlier they worked for the rulers. So their patrons were connoisseurs, they understood and they compensated them handsomely. Over the period of time with lot of diversification, so they have to depend on the general people for their art to be appreciated, to be made economical for them. So that needs a kind of change in perspective how we support the artists. Earlier it was patronizing, now it is expecting the people to support them. But again, they do not need to compromise on the quality of their work, their performance. So that back end and forward. So it is government's, I think, duty as well as responsibility to think about the forward and the backward linkages so that they are sustaining themselves. One positive aspect that one can see is that over the period of time, all art forms, whether you talk of literature, whether you talk of music, whether you talk of handicrafts, they have evolved, they have become more inclusive. And what we say is democratization of culture and creativity and economy. Because now they are accessible to all, everyone can see it, everyone can get it customized. So, like if we talk about music, the Langa Mangania music, which was once a kind of dying art almost 2-3 decades back, but somehow they revived themselves. Now they have gone for fusion and all because they know that that is the actual demand. So it has become more of a demand driven sector. So it is here where the government steps in, that this is the demand in the economy, this is our supply side, but what are the gaps? There we try to bridge in the gaps. And as you rightly said, the kind of interventions, the kind of support system, the artisan identity card, giving them health insurance, giving them education, giving them social insurance. So that initiative has actually become a role model for other states to follow.
Change of perspective. Piali, does the sector need subsidy or investment or a mixture of both?
I think mixture of both. Yeah, I think we were talking about it earlier that we're really grateful that there's a body like Arts Council and there is a subsidy that is provided for many artists here. There is a slight negative side of it is that dependency on subsidy.
And also entitlement sometimes.
And entitlement, which is slightly worrying. So I feel that the way that things are moving now, that things are shifting, that artists are and they are savvy. It's a mixed economy. They understand that some work they will get subsidized for, and there has to be other work that has to have other values, whether it's entertainment, whether it is working in the health sector, whether it's learning sector, whether it's working with older people. There are many other ways that an artist can engage, or even as producers, as creatives, managers. There are so many other options that they need to skill themselves up and engage, and in a way promote themselves as well, because the whole world is on a marketing spree, I would say, isn't it? Yeah, it's how you market yourself. That in itself is a big business. Online, offline, whatever it is. And I do feel that the younger generation, are very savvy. They know how to use it much more creatively. And we are learning. I am still on a huge learning curve. Every other day I learn a new technology or a new skill, or I don't know, and then I ask my colleagues, like, what's going on here? How do you connect? But that commitment to saying that I don't know, I want to learn is also very important, because we, as an organization, we work with the younger generation, the emerging professionals, but we also work with mid-career artists. And we just can't ignore them while things are moving on. So how do we, expand the field? So, yeah, I think savviness is essential.
Well, marketing needs a whole different panel.
As a whole
I remember V.S. Naipaul saying one day, he said to me, Sanjoy, I am a writer. My job is to write. I am not a performing monkey.
Oh my God.
And left it at that. So that's a whole different conversation.
How life has changed.
Skinder, the digital economy and its impact on the arts. And we're seeing this. I mean, we've seen that certainly with us, from 500,000 people on the ground in Jaipur to 27.5 million. Not that sponsors give a damn, but they love to see the numbers, but they won't match the whatever. But what is its impact on artists, artisans, and the world that we're going to see in the future?
Well, we've seen a snippet of the revolution at play, or kind of a digital renaissance of sorts happening over the last 2 years. Just looking at the publishing sector in the UK, it's earned an extra half a billion pounds in the last 2 years by introducing a new way of connecting with its consumer, its customer. We've seen also in India, with the crafts, for example, having to reinvent. I mean, 22% of the crafts industry in India, according to our research, lost 75% of its income. It had to reinvent. It created something called D2C. So the idea of direct to customer using digital. So they're creating platforms in which whereby they're creating crafts and channeling it across the world. So we've seen that. I've just come back from Davos. There's some interesting conversations happening there. There always feels like bringing technology into the mix. Are we dehumanizing ourselves in that process? Is there a risk that we are going to become, in a sense, semi-robot? In the sense that we're semi-cyber, semi-human. Well, actually, there is talk about embedding technology into the body that enables us to be more savvy in terms of how we think. The key thing here is that the arts and the humanities needs to embrace digital and technology, needs to embrace data, but it needs to also keep the kind of humane element and the soul of what it is to be human in its intersection with the non-human, with biodiversity, and most of all, the technology, so that we're not colonized by it, because there is a risk that that is the new colonialism, the artificial intelligence and the bias that it has, that is impinged upon us. But I've seen the shift definitely in across the world in terms of how people are embracing digital. And I think the new generation, well, it's something that they're born with, and it's something that's normal. There are some challenges in terms of, is it more about information and knowing how to access the information rather than apply the wisdom of that knowledge, of that information into knowledgeable choice and decision making. So it is this kind of fast and furious world that we're moving into that might be superficial. So we have to guard against that. And as Piali says, mitigate risks around those issues.
Marcus de Soto has written a brilliant book on AI and the arts, and everybody should read that book in terms of what it predicts and how it's going to work, etc. Roly, I'm going to come to you with the last question before we open up. Does the arts sector or the creative sector, do we need to come together, to collaborate, to get the right narrative out? I mean, we've got Deepa sitting here. She's part of Catalyst 2030, which is trying to work on the UN SDGs, for example, a body that moves beyond and sort of connects organizations across the world. Do we need something to be able to get that right narrative so that we can stand up and say to each of our governments and corporates and everybody else involved that this is the reason why it's absolutely important to be able to invest and support the arts? And yes, it is a sunshine sector because it will and is the largest employer of beings, of people. And it's through that you can generate more innovation, because that's what artists do, whether it's process or invention or anything else.
Well, Sanjoy, I mean, in a sense, what you by setting up this panel are part of that. This is part of collective storytelling, and we of course endlessly need to get better in that. In a sense, you're asking a bigger version of the question you began with, which is how do you evidence this? And we barely, by the way, talked about the huge, unambiguously creative commercial sector around television, film, some of the commercial music, which, when governments are ready to listen, of course, is a massively growing, huge part, 8% of UK exports, if not more, and growing all the time. So there are some powerful figures there, which I suspect most nations, certainly developing nations, will have versions of. And you're beginning to see that play out in the diversification of culture globally, and there's lots of positives coming through the technological route. But I suppose I wouldn't want the arts, cultural sector, I wouldn't call it, to kind of gather the wagons and get inward looking and just cook up a story. Our real job is to do what those new generation creatives are already doing, which is ignoring the boundaries with business, technology, and so on, and getting upstream of it. And yes, we mustn't be ignorant of the potential power of AI, but frankly, the people designing AI mustn't be ignorant of the power and value of culture and technology. And this is something we're literally talking about next week here. We host the Alan Turing Institute here, which is the UK's Centre for Artificial Intelligence and Data Science, and we were excited to be able to bring them here because we saw maybe the beginnings of an opportunity to get upstream of literally the design of algorithms of AI and let that holistic view of knowledge and civilization influence that, because it's only if we do that as a society that actually the magic of digital, and at its best it is magical, it's empowering, will be a positive force and not the what you were saying happened in the last decade, the divisive one, which we all lived through.
Gayatri, from your side, as government, as the senior most bureaucrat there, what is it that we need to do to be able to get this narrative across to you and sort of say that you don't need to be suspicious of this sector, but what we can do is join hands to be able to find the last mile solutions, both in terms of getting the word out and a story out, but also working with so many millions of people to change lives, to change narratives, and to change the way that we perceive the world, especially a world in crisis with climate change as it is?
Yeah. So Sanjoy, I think that government on one hand has its own approach, but it is the civil society, it is people like you who give visibility to the art culture sector in a more happening way. You know, those who have worked with the governments and the councils, there is a very structured way of going about things. But the level where JLF was at the beginning and where you have taken it today, this flexibility, this innovation, this different kind of spices that you keep on adding it makes very appreciative to the audience and it makes it acceptable as well. So I think both of us should team up and give as many platforms as possible and open more and more avenues so that they have, we are not restricting them to only particular age group, particular sector, only restricting them exposure to some sorts of festivals. It has to be demand driven because there is lot of talent, potential lying hidden. They are waiting for opportunities. On one hand, there is the world wanting to have different kind of experiences. So how do we bridge the gap? So I think these kinds of platforms are the ideal way of bridging this gap, making a lot of noise about it and making the government, shaking the government away out of its slumber and telling this is what you need to do.
I think we need to move beyond even the demand, because if we had done the dipstick survey as the Harvard Business School teaches that we have this 5-year, 10-year, 15-year plan to take over the world, but if we were to have done a dipstick survey whether Jaipur would be perhaps the place for one of the largest literary gatherings, we would have been laughed out of hearth and home 15 years ago, but we just went ahead and did it. I think one of the things is that we need to kickstart stuff that will result finally in a change of mindset at the educational level, at the design level, at the innovation level, and of course at the level of the economy. On that happy note, any questions? Deepa?
Wait for the mic.
Mike, I'll take a couple of questions at a time and then we'll ask the panel to answer. Deepa, Mike?
Thank you. I'm really interested in the sustaining element of this and the infrastructure needed in order to sustain the creative economy. Gayatri, you spoke really well about social security. And I think one of the challenges that, Skinder, you talked about tech platforms. Things like Creative Dignity started in India as a way of linking artisans to consumer because they are part of the informal economy. And the lack of infrastructure to support rural artisans and social entrepreneurs have had to create these platforms in order to sustain themselves and sustain livelihoods during the pandemic. So what is the role of governments and organisations like the British Council as funders in looking at de-risking? And providing different types of innovative finance so that you can make a move from informal to formal economy, like the initiatives that are happening in India. But in the Western world, it's all gig economy based. And so you've got major risk associated with people who are on temporary contracts and the like. And so therefore sustaining it has to be about sustaining those livelihoods and providing the infrastructure to support communities and support individuals who form part of that. So I'm quite interested in the role of the government.
So you want to take that first?
No, it's a really important question around sort of sustainability, infrastructure, what I call the engine under the bonnet, the unseen machinery that's going to keep it going, keep that sheeny, shiny vehicle jumping around the terrain at the speed it needs to, and adjusting accordingly. Now, for that to happen, there is a lot that needs to be in place. Obviously, it needs the support of the ecology, but the investment into that ecology needs to be in place too. So there is a group called Policy and Evidence Centre that looks at it's policy. It's called PEC International. It's run by Nesta, and we convene it. And we bring across international thinkers around this economy. So the creative industries, including the informal economy. But they have an 11-point plan, and I can't remember all the 11 points, but I'll give you a flavour. So one of the key things is just thinking about, well, what is it about the informal economy, what it is about the formal economy, and what investment needs to go in to bridge that. There's a lot of work that needs to be done around research and development, the application of data, international cooperation in terms of how certain taxes work, how certain data is used, so there are consistent standards in terms of how we're measuring and connecting. I think the whole area around education and skills, understanding the careers and the pathways to enter these careers is so important. Looking at how new money works, new investment works, in order for this infrastructure to work. Now that sounds like an 11-point plan just shared on stage. Now to make that happen is not so straightforward, obviously, because you do need government policy, you do need educational sort of systems in place, you do need an infrastructure of a cultural sector and a creative industry that looks at the continuum of subsidy to commercial and what that continuum is, and you do need multiple models in terms of running a business. Some of the new generation kids are saying to me, and I shouldn't call them kids, but new generation thinkers then, are what they're saying to me is that actually we don't want government funding anymore because it ties us down. What we're going for are different ways, informal methodologies, which are a bit more experimental, a bit more fast, a bit more furious. But look, this is a big question. It's, like I said, it's not going to be answered on stage, but you've opened up probably a can of worms because it hasn't been resolved. And we're constantly having to talk about it. I mean, I was in Venice, I was talking to a philanthropist, and he said to me that as cultural leaders, we have failed. We have failed to make an impact on those that make the big decisions. He thinks that at a click of a button, that the commercial sector, private sector, can bring a solution with us. But there's too much of a bridge to be built still. And so building those bridges, and for example, the informal economy is massive, particularly in places like India, and even here, in the UK, that transition is not understood fully. So there is some research to be done. But investing in that research is so important, so that it impacts on policy, and therefore the investment that then filters into the multitude of systems at play. That be their roots, be that the gatekeepers or the established, or certainly the kind of emerging, inventive sort of pioneers that I know exist in the periphery.
Gayatri, did you want to take?
Yeah, actually, what I actually feel is that our very focus or obsession of bringing the informal to the formal sector sometimes leads to digresses from the actual aim what we are wanting to achieve, right? Like these kind of sectors which are more seasonal, which are more especially if I talk in reference to my state. So it depends on what kind of tourists are there, what kind of area is there, what kind of festivals are there, what kind of audience is there. So to formalize the entire thing will kill the entire creative aspect of it. So the thing is that we make it so handsomely remunerative. Now how do you do it? So that has to be kept in mind, and automatically the rest of the things will be taken care of. This is what I feel.
Roly, did you have input?
Nothing.
Anything?
The only thing I was going to say, Sanjoy, my theory around the fertile ground. So sometimes the solution doesn't sit. So it's just like you said. It's about creating the environment for the fertile ground. The soil needs to be right. We've got all sorts of issues with soil anyway, but the soil within the kind of
You need
creative
to create
industry.
that whatever. Interestingly, Graham has just come back. Graham has just come back from India after putting together a mapping of the creative sector there. So it would have been great to hear him. But go ahead.
Thank you all for most interesting discussion, which I feel is very, very important. And I feel it's something that could bear very great fruit, potentially. One of my great passions in life is the great Rabindranath Tagore. And he must have been one of the most creative human beings who's ever walked this earth. And close beside him, our beloved Gandhi, again, extraordinarily creative. I wonder, in this quest for moving forward, for India and for the world, do the panel feel there are lessons we can learn? To me, these are like crown jewels, along with the Vedas, crown jewels of India that have been somehow sort of lost in the sidelines, gathering a sort of dust, and yet the very crown jewels. I just respectfully ask, do you feel we can learn, we can reconnect, we can revitalize, we can have India as a beacon for the planet?
Let's ask them. Who wants to take that? Anybody?
Can I be a bit controversial?
Oh, you have to be. Why have you been invited?
Yeah, there's appropriation issues as well, and misappropriation. There are a lot of jewels, crown jewels, and ideas, and creativity, and all of that. Historically, how they have been appropriated and misappropriated, and how the ownership has then shifted is another debate. It's a big debate, and it's a difficult one, another big kind of ones. So I absolutely appreciate what you are saying, and of course I identify with that. Tagore is a guiding light for many of us here. And I think he is universal anyway. I don't think we need to push that anymore. Yes, of course we do, but I think he is, he gives solace, he connects across the board. So, yeah, we need to probably recognize that a bit more. I think it's recognizing that, giving that recognition. Yes, definitely. I would worry about.
Yoga has replaced the Mahatma Gandhi in terms of yoga being, sexier right now
Yes.
than Mahatma Gandhi. But
I
there's
know.
a whole separate dialogue on
It's a
that.
whole
But I'm
separate
sorry, we're
dialogue.
going to have to end this. So thank you so much, Skinder, Piali, Roly, Gayatri, Rathore. Thank you all very much for this an ongoing conversation.
Thank you.
Yes.
Pardon